There's a moment, and if you've ever been to Buckingham Palace, maybe you know the one where everything just goes completely still. The tourists stop talking. The pigeons freeze. And even the wind sort of holds its breath. I witnessed one of those moments on a Tuesday afternoon in October. And I still think about it. It was one of those London days where the sky can't decide what it wants to do. Not raining, not sunny, just that flat, grey kind of light that makes everything feel a little cinematic without trying. I was there with my cousin Harpreet, who had flown in from Canada and had this whole checklist of London things she wanted to tick off before she flew back on Friday. Buckingham Palace was number 3 on that list, right after Tower Bridge and a proper full English breakfast. We got there around 2:30. The changing of the guard had already ended. We'd missed it by about 40 minutes, which Harpreet was still annoyed about, but the area outside the palace gates was still buzzing. It always is. There's something about that place that pulls people in even when nothing official is happening. Maybe it's the iron gates, blackened, gold and absolutely enormous. Maybe it's the red-coated guards you can see standing in their sentry boxes, completely motionless, like statues that someone forgot to finish. The tourist crowd was the usual mix. Families with matching rain jackets. A school group from somewhere in Italy, teenagers half listening to their guide. A couple of American tourists reading from a guidebook out loud to each other. Harpreet was trying to get a good angle for a photo without too many strangers in the background, which is basically impossible outside the palace. I was standing a bit off to the side, eating a packet of salt and vinegar crisps, the tiny ones from the corner shop, and just watching people. That's honestly my favorite thing to do in crowds. You pick up so much. That's when I first noticed the little girl. She was maybe 5, 6 years old at most. Wearing a bright yellow raincoat, the kind with the toggle buttons, and little white trainers that had already gone a bit gray from the pavement. She was standing maybe 15 feet from one of the sentry boxes, just staring at the guard. At first I thought she was just being a curious kid. Children always stare at the guards. There's something magnetic about them, the tall bearskin hat, the stillness, the complete refusal to acknowledge that the entire world is happening around them. Kids find that fascinating and a little bit frightening at the same time. But then, I noticed something. She wasn't staring with curiosity. Her face was doing something else entirely. Her bottom lip was trembling. Her eyes, even from where I was standing, I could see, were filling up. And she was looking around in that way children do when they're trying very hard not to cry and losing the battle badly. She was lost. No adult near her. Nobody bending down, nobody reaching for her hand. She was completely alone in that crowd, and the crowd had no idea. I looked around for someone, a parent, a teacher, anyone scanning the area the way panicked parents do. I didn't see anyone. Harpreet had wandered closer to the gates and hadn't noticed. Most people near the little girl were looking at their phones or their cameras. The world was just moving around her like water around a stone. The girl took a few small, uncertain steps. Then, she stopped. Then, she looked at the guard again. And then, she started to cry. Not a loud, dramatic cry. The quiet kind. The kind that actually breaks your heart more than the loud version. She was pressing her fists to her eyes and her little shoulders were shaking and she was doing everything a small person does when they're trying to hold something enormous inside a very small body. I was already moving toward her. I dropped my crisp packet and was cutting through the crowd, but I wasn't the closest person to her. The guard was now. I need you to understand something about the royal guards before I tell you what happened next. They don't move. That's the whole point. They are trained, and, I mean seriously, rigorously trained, to stand absolutely still and maintain their post regardless of what's happening around them. Tourists try everything. People wave in their faces. People stand inches from them and take photos. People say the most outrageous things, trying to get any reaction at all. And they get nothing. Because that is the discipline. That is the job. The stillness is not just ceremonial, it's a demonstration of control, of professionalism, of something almost inhuman in the best possible way. So when I saw the guard's eyes move just slightly, just a few degrees to the right, I thought I'd imagined it. Then, his head turned. It was the smallest movement. If you blinked, you'd have missed it. But, he had seen her. This enormous man, probably 6'2" in his boots, standing there like a piece of architecture, he had clocked this tiny, crying little girl, and something in him had shifted. I stopped walking. Because I wanted to see what he would do. For a second, nothing. He was clearly in a conflict, you could almost feel it from 10 meters away. His body was still perfectly upright, still rigid, still every inch the ceremonial soldier he was trained to be. But, his eyes were on that girl. And, they weren't the eyes of a statue. Then, he broke protocol. Not dramatically. Not with a shout or a sudden movement. He did it the way you do something when you've made a quiet, private decision. He stepped out of his sentry box, one step, then two, and he lowered himself, slowly, onto one knee. Right there on the pavement outside Buckingham Palace. This great tall man in his red tunic and his enormous bearskin hat, kneeling down so that he was at eye level with a 6-year-old girl in a yellow raincoat. The crowd around them didn't immediately notice. Then, one by one, people turned. Phones went down. Conversations stopped. The Italian teenagers stopped fidgeting. I saw Harpreet turn around from the gate, look, and just go completely still. The guard didn't say anything at first. He just stayed there, at her level, letting her see him. Letting this small, terrified child understand that something big and safe was looking directly at her. The girl looked up at him. Her crying hiccuped the way it does when something suddenly breaks through the distress, and she blinked at him through her tears. Then, he spoke. I was close enough to catch it. His voice, and this is the part one keep coming back to, was so completely different from what you'd expect from someone who looks like that. It was low, careful, the kind of voice you use with a small animal you don't want to frighten. He said, "It's all right, little one. You're safe here." That was it. 5 words. But, the girl's face, God, her face did something extraordinary. The trembling stopped. Not all at once, but like a wave settling after the wind drops. She looked at him, at the red coat and the absurd tall hat and the white-gloved hands, and somehow she decided she trusted him completely. She nodded. Wiped her nose with her sleeve. He turned his head just slightly, and I realized he was looking for someone. He said something quietly, and I only caught one word, radio. There must have been a communication device or a colleague nearby, because within about 90 seconds, a female officer in a dark uniform appeared, calm and professional, already scanning the crowd for a distressed adult. But, here's the moment that really got me. While they waited just those 90 seconds, the little girl reached out and touched the guard's sleeve. Just one finger, on the red fabric. Curious, tentative, the way children touch things they're not sure are real. He didn't pull away. He didn't stiffen. He just looked down at her hand and, then, back at her face, and he said something I couldn't hear this time. But, she smiled. This tiny, wet-faced, completely lost little girl, she smiled at him. The mother appeared like a force of nature about 2 minutes later. She'd been near the far side of the crowd, completely blind to what had happened, and the female officer had found her through the communication link. She came through the crowd moving the way parents move when they've just realized their child is missing, that specific terrified sprint that only parents can do. She dropped to her knees and grabbed the girl so fast and so completely that for a second all you could see was yellow raincoat and dark hair and a mother's hands gripping the back of her child's jacket like she was never letting go again. The girl started crying again then. Properly this time, the loud, relieved kind, because she was safe and her mom was there and she could finally let it all out. The guard had risen. He was standing straight again, tall, proper, composed. He'd stepped back toward his post. If you'd arrived 30 seconds later, you'd have had no idea anything had happened at all. But, the mother noticed him. She looked up from her daughter's shoulder, her own face completely undone, mascara going, eyes red, the whole thing, and she looked at him. He gave her the smallest nod. Not a bow. Not a gesture of self-congratulation. Just an acknowledgement. I see you. She's safe. The mother pressed one hand to her heart. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Around us, the crowd had gone very quiet in the way that crowds do when they've collectively witnessed something that has touched them somewhere private. A few people had their hands over their mouths. I saw one older man, tall, gray-haired, in a green wax jacket, slowly applaud 2-3 claps before stopping himself, as though he'd suddenly remembered the guard wouldn't respond. He was right. The guard didn't respond. He was back in his sentry box, eyes forward, still as stone. But, if you looked very carefully, and I was looking very carefully, there was something around his eyes. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than that. Harpreet appeared beside me and grabbed my arm. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "Yeah," I said. She didn't say anything else for a bit. Then, "I'm glad we missed the changing of the guard. People think royal guards are props. Part of the scenery. Something to photograph between lunch and the gift shop." I used to think that too. I don't anymore. Not since I saw what happened to an old man named Arthur outside Windsor Castle on a freezing Thursday in February. Setup: Windsor is different from Buckingham Palace. London feels enormous and anonymous, you can disappear into it. Windsor is smaller, older, more contained. The town wraps around the castle like it was built specifically for that purpose, which I suppose it was. The streets are narrow and cobbled in places, and, in February, with no leaves on the trees and the cold coming off the Thames, the whole place feels like something from a black and white photograph. I was there for work, sort of. I'm a freelance photographer, mostly architecture, sometimes events, and I'd been commissioned to get some establishing shots of the castle exterior for a heritage publication. Early morning light is best for that kind of thing, which meant I was up and at the long walk before 8 o'clock, breath clouding in front of me, fingers already complaining about the temperature inside my gloves. The crowds were thin that early. A few joggers. A woman walking 2 enormous dogs that looked more like small horses. Some other photographers, you can always spot them, they have that slightly manic, sleep-deprived look and they're carrying too much equipment. By 9:30, a few more tourists had arrived. And the guards had taken their posts. There's something about seeing a royal guard at Windsor that's different from London. Maybe it's the scale of the castle behind them, genuinely medieval, genuinely enormous, that makes the whole thing feel less like a tourist attraction and more like something that actually means something. Like history that isn't finished yet. I'd gotten most of my shots by 10 o'clock and was packing up near the Henry VIII gate, warming my hands around a terrible coffee I'd bought from a van near the car park, when I noticed Arthur. Build tension, I didn't know his name was Arthur at that point, obviously. I just noticed an old man. He was sitting on a low stone wall a short distance from the gate, not right up against it, but near enough that it was clear he'd positioned himself deliberately. He was wearing a heavy dark coat, the old-fashioned kind with the wide lapels, and a flat cap pulled down over his ears. His hands were in his pockets and he was completely still in the way that very old people sometimes are, not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of someone who has learned to exist inside their own thoughts. He had a paper bag from a bakery on his lap. It was unopened. He'd been sitting there for at least 20 minutes by the time I noticed him, and he hadn't touched it. Something about him made me slow down. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe the way he was looking at the castle, not with the bright, photographing, tourist exclaiming kind of looking, but with something else. Something long and deep and private. I went back to my coffee. Tried not to stare. But I kept glancing over. The guard at the nearest post was a young man. I'd been vaguely aware of him for the past hour, hard to miss, really, in the red tunic and the bearskin, standing at parade rest near the gate. He'd been completely motionless for as long as I'd been watching him, which had been most of the morning. He was maybe 22, 23. Built like someone who took the physical fitness requirements very seriously. I noticed, after a while, that the guard was looking at the old man. Not in the performing their duty way. Not scanning the crowd. Specifically, quietly, looking at the old man on the wall. The old man had still not opened his paper bag. It was February. It was cold. And this man had been sitting alone outside Windsor Castle for half an hour with an unopened bag of food in his lap and an expression on his face that I was now finding very difficult to look away from. Because I'd placed the expression. I knew what it was. It was grief. Climax, the guard moved at approximately 10:20. Again, not dramatically. This wasn't a charge or a sudden action. It was the quiet, deliberate movement of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it. He marched, and royal guards do march, even when they're just moving a few meters. It's in the training, from his post to the edge of his permitted area. He stopped. Then, he did something that I genuinely did not expect. He spoke first. "Sir," he said. Loud enough for the old man to hear, but not loud enough for the general crowd. "Are you all right?" The old man looked up. He seemed surprised, not in a startled way, but in the way of someone who had been very far away in their head and had just been gently called back. He looked at the guard. Looked at the uniform. Something crossed his face that I couldn't entirely read. "All right," the old man said. His voice was the kind that London gives to people who've lived there their whole lives, not posh, not rough, just real. "No, son. Not particularly. Now." The guard could have left it there. That would have been the proper, protocol response. He had checked on a member of the public. The member of the public had responded. Continue duties. He didn't leave it there. He said, "Do you need any assistance, sir?" The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then, he said, "I just needed to come here. My wife, she used to love this place. We came every anniversary. 43 years. He paused. She passed in November. The crowd around them, there weren't many people, but there were some, had gone very quiet. The guard stood perfectly straight. His face, what you could see of it beneath the bearskin, was serious and still. But he didn't retreat. He didn't give a perfunctory, "I'm sorry for your loss," and march back. He stayed. 43 years, he repeated. Not a question. Just acknowledging the weight of it. She wanted to come in October, the old man said, almost to himself. We'd booked it and everything. She didn't make it to October. I had stopped pretending to do anything else. My camera was in my bag and I was just standing there, probably staring, but I couldn't help it. The guard, this young man, probably younger than some people's children, wearing a ceremonial uniform on a cold February morning outside a royal castle, bent slightly forward. Not kneeling this time. Something more adult. Aline, the kind you do when you're listening properly. He said, she'd have been glad you came. It was such a simple thing. Such an ordinary human thing to say. And it cracked the old man completely open. He didn't wail. He wasn't that kind of man, I don't think. But he pressed his lips together very hard and his chin went, and he turned his face away for a moment. His hand came up and pressed against his eyes beneath his flat cap. The guard waited. He just waited. When the old man composed himself and looked back, the guard gave him something I can only describe as a look of complete, unhurried respect. Not pity. Not performance. Just acknowledgement. Of who this man was. Of what this day meant. Would you like to sit for a while? The guard said. You're all right here. The old man nodded. I'll have my sandwich, he said, which made the guard just barely, almost smile. Good idea, he said. It's cold. He stood upright again. Returned to his post. And, yet somehow, his presence near the gate for the next 20 minutes felt different. He was still doing his job. Still fully, properly on duty. But, he'd also extended something invisible and real over that old man on the wall. A kind of protection that had nothing to do with security. Resolution, Arthur, that was his name. I found out because he told it to me, because after the guard went back I found myself walking over and asking if I could sit nearby, and we ended up talking for 40 minutes. Arthur had been married to his wife Margaret since 1981. She was mad for royalty, he said, opening his paper bag at last and offering me half a sausage roll that I absolutely accepted. Not in a silly way. In a proper way. She said it was history made visible. That's how she talked. He looked at the castle. I thought it would feel closer to her, coming here. I don't know if it does. I asked if it helped at all, what the guard had said. He thought about it. It wasn't what he said, exactly, Arthur told me. It was that he said anything at all. You don't expect it, do you? You think they're like clockwork. He paused. He reminded me that people are still paying attention. Even when you think no one is. He finished his sausage roll and stood up slowly, with the careful movements of someone whose joints have opinions about the cold. He straightened his coat. Replaced his flat cap. He looked at the guard one more time. The guard, of course, did not look back. He was on duty, eyes forward, every inch the ceremonial soldier. But Arthur nodded at him anyway. A small, private thank you, sent in a direction whether or not it was received. Then, he walked away down the cobbled street, and I watched him go, and I think that was the moment I started crying a bit myself, though I'd never have admitted it to Harpreet. Some things you see, you think, I need to remember every single detail of this. Because if I don't hold it carefully, it'll blur into the general noise of life, and I'll lose it. I've held this one very carefully for 3 years. It happened outside the Horse Guards parade. And it started with rain. Setup: London rain in March is not the dramatic kind. It's not a storm you can tell a story about. It's fine, persistent, quietly relentless, the kind that gets into your collar before you've noticed it's started and soaks through everything by the time you've found your umbrella. I was there because my firm, I work in corporate communications, which sounds more impressive than it is, had a client lunch near Whitehall, and I'd arrived 40 minutes early like I always do because I cannot stand being late, and I'd wandered down to Horse Guards parade to fill the time. Horse Guards is one of those London places that tourists who haven't done their research sometimes stumble across by accident and, then, feel like they've found something hidden, which I always love to see. It's not hidden at all, it's right there, open to the street, but it has this quality of being slightly removed from the tourist circuit, slightly less loud than the palace, and the mounted guards there have this particular stillness that I find genuinely extraordinary. That morning there were both mounted and foot guards. The mounted soldiers, the household cavalry, on their black horses, were the main draw for the handful of tourists present, most of whom were trying to get a photo of themselves next to a horse without the horse noticing. The foot guards were at their posts nearer the arch. I was standing under the overhang of a building across the courtyard, keeping dry, checking my emails and looking up every few minutes because I can't entirely ignore Horse Guards parade even when I'm trying to be productive. That's when I saw him come in from the street side. Build tension, he was older. Mid-70s, I'd have said. He walked with a stick, not the kind you lean on heavily, but the kind you use for balance when your body occasionally disagrees with the direction you're going. His coat was a good one, dark wool, properly cut, not new, but cared for. And, on his lapel, visible even from where I was standing across the courtyard, was a cluster of medals. Not modern ones. Not fresh. These were the kind of medals that sit against a coat like they've always lived there, worn smooth at the edges, important in a way that goes beyond decoration. He walked into the courtyard slowly and stood in the rain without an umbrella. Just stood there, looking at the arch, looking at the guards, looking at the parade ground. I'm not sure he'd really taken account of the rain. He seemed to be somewhere else entirely. There were maybe 12 tourists scattered around the courtyard. Most of them had noticed the medals. You could see them doing that thing people do, a kind of double take, a quiet nudge to whoever they were with. A few people gave him small, uncertain nods, the kind you give when you want to acknowledge something but don't know exactly what to say or whether saying anything is wanted. He didn't notice any of them. He was just standing in the rain, looking at Horse Guards parade, and the rain was doing what London rain does, and after a few minutes his shoulders were dark with it and his white hair was flattened against his head and he still didn't move. I'd put my phone away by now. The foot guard closest to him, posted at the edge of the arch, was watching him. I clocked that almost immediately because I'd been people watching all morning and I knew exactly where the guard's eyes had been pointing for the last 5 minutes. Then, something happened that I'd never seen before and haven't seen since. Climax, the guard left his post. Not like the others I've described, not a small, discreet movement. He marched. Properly, formally, with all the precision of the training behind him. He marched out from under the arch, across the courtyard, and he stopped directly in front of the old man in the rain. And he came to attention. Full attention. Heels together, shoulders back, rifle precisely aligned, chin up. The kind of attention that is not just posture but statement. It says, I see you. I recognize you. I am honoring you. The old man blinked. He looked at the guard as though he couldn't quite process what was happening. The tourists went completely still. I mean completely. Even the horses seemed to feel something shift in the air. The guard held his position for 3 full seconds, I counted, automatically, the way you count things when you're not sure they're real, and then, slowly, deliberately, he brought his free hand up and saluted. Not a casual salute. Not the kind of thing you do because you're supposed to. The kind of salute that has weight to it. The kind that means something has been recognized and acknowledged by one person who understands, to another person who understands. The old man's face changed completely. His chin came up. His back straightened, not much, not a young man's straightening, but the kind that happens when something inside you responds to something outside you. His grip tightened on his walking stick. And then, and I will carry this moment for the rest of my life, he returned the salute. His right hand came up, slower than the guard's, the joints clearly not what they once were, and he held it there. And, for a moment, maybe 4 seconds, maybe 5, these two men, generations apart, in the rain outside Horse Guards Parade, just held each other's salute. Nobody in the courtyard made a sound. I realized I had both hands pressed over my mouth. I don't know when that had happened. When they came down from the salute, the guard spoke. I was maybe 30 feet away and the rain was making noise on the cobblestones, but I caught pieces of it. I heard service and I heard thank you and I heard honored. The old man said something back. His voice was stronger than I expected, given how still and inward he'd seemed a moment before. I caught a word that sounded like Falklands and then, something I couldn't make out. The guard listened. He listened the way people rarely listen, with his entire body, leaning slightly in, giving every signal that what he was hearing mattered and the person saying it mattered. Then, he did one more thing. He turned back toward the arch and said something to a colleague, a brief, quiet exchange, and then, he turned back to the old man and said, clearly enough for me to hear this time, would you like to stand out of the rain, sir? You can stand under the arch. Now. I don't know the exact protocols of Horse Guards Parade. But, I know enough to know that inviting a member of the public to stand in a restricted area of a royal ceremonial post is not a standard move. Whatever the rule was or wasn't, this guard had made a judgment call. The old man looked at the arch. He looked at the guard. He said, I don't want to cause any fuss. The guard said, firmly and quietly, it's not a fuss, sir. Please. The old man nodded. And, the guard, this young soldier in his ceremonial uniform, walked beside him across the courtyard, matching his pace, not rushing him, and stood with him under the arch as the London rain came down on the empty parade ground. They stood together for perhaps 10 minutes. Talking, occasionally. Quiet, mostly. The old man's eyes moved around the space with the expression of someone revisiting something old and important inside their own memory. At one point, the old man pointed at something, one of the horses, I think, and said something, and the guard actually laughed. A small, real laugh. Resolution, I completely missed my client lunch. I sent an apologetic message, said I'd been held up, rescheduled for Thursday. My colleague was annoyed. I couldn't bring myself to care. The old man left after about 15 minutes under the arch. The guard escorted him, properly, formally, back to the entrance of the courtyard, then, came back to attention, and the old man turned and looked at him one last time. He didn't salute again. He just said something. And, from the movement of his lips and the expression on his face, I'm fairly sure it was "Thank you, son." The guard nodded. Then, he marched back to his post. Just like that. As though none of it had happened. Except it had. And, the 12 tourists in that courtyard knew it had happened, and none of us were entirely the same as we'd been 40 minutes earlier. A woman near me, late 40s, American accent, a camera bag over one shoulder, turned and said to no one in particular, "Who was he?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. But, later, when I was walking back through Whitehall, turning the whole thing over in my head, I found I didn't think it mattered exactly. It wasn't about rank or regiment or the specific history those medals represented. It was about something older and simpler than any of that. It was about one person saying to another, "I see what you've carried. And I respect it." That's it. That's the whole thing. I've talked to people about that morning since. Some of them want to know if the guard got in trouble for leaving his post. Honestly? I don't know. I hope not. I think any commanding officer who'd watched what I watched would have had a hard time calling it anything other than the right thing to do. Others want to know if the old man was okay, if he had someone waiting for him, somewhere to go. I don't know that either. He walked out through the arch and into Whitehall, and the city swallowed him the way London swallows everyone, gently and completely. I hope he was okay. I think about him sometimes, on March mornings when the rain comes in fine and gray and relentless.